Want to sand your 3D print super smooth, ready for paint? Well, let me show you how. Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name's Luke, and in this video, I'm going to be taking you through my process of sanding 3D prints. I'm going to be taking you through my process of the sanding parts, the filling, the priming, the wet sanding, so that you have a super smooth base for your prints so that they are ready for paint. Now, this Clone Trooper helmet is going to be the demonstration for this video. The reason I picked this is because I'm doing this for another project, but it also has a lot of edges, little nooks and crannies, and all these little edges and stuff that you'll find on a lot of 3D prints, but the Clone has it all in one, so it's kind of a really good one to demonstrate on. So without further ado, we're going to get into the first part, which is the sanding. So after the helmet has been printed, the first thing we need to do is hit the whole helmet with a round of 80 grit sandpaper on an orbital sander. So the reason I'm going to be using the 80 grit is because it's going to go through the helmet a lot quicker, say rather 180 or 240, which is going to take a lot longer to smooth out, whereas the 80 is just going to knock everything down, sort of make it relatively even, and then we're going to hit the whole helmet with 180 grit sandpaper. The 180 will start to smooth out any of the scratches or swirls that the 80 had caused, and we'll start to make everything sort of look a little bit more even. Then you can start to see where you're going to need to eventually fill and maybe do a little bit more work in hand sanding, which we'll get to later. Now for this, I am using an orbital sander, so it is electric, so it's going to do the bulk of the work for us without having your arm die. Now I am just using the Ryobi OnePlus. This was a nice cheap version one. Really, any orbital sander is going to work perfectly for this. It's just, obviously, the more power you're going to have, the more careful you need to be. With these orbital sanders, if you start to hold in the one spot for a very long time, you're going to start to warp and bend and bow the 3D print, because obviously 3D prints are formed when it's heated. So you definitely have to be going over the thing. So when I sand this, I will explain a little bit more, but I don't sit in the one spot for a very long time. I will do the whole thing and quite a few passes so that the helmet kind of cools itself. Then we hit it again, it heats up, cools, and this way it's the best, safest way to not be melting and denting your prints, because I've done it once and it's not very easy to fix. You kind of need to throw the thing in the bin and start again. So without further ado, we're going to get on to sanding the helmet with 80 grit. I will do a little bit of explaining over the time lapse on what I'm exactly doing. So let's get to that now. So now we have the whole helmet sanded in the 80 grit and then the 180 grit. Now you will notice that this little bit hasn't been sanded, in and around this back hasn't been sanded, all these tighter edges up here also haven't been sanded, and that's because, like I said, the sander doesn't manage to get into these little nooks and crannies because the orbital piece is so big. So that's where the next step comes in, which is the hand sanding. So for the hand sanding, I'm going to use the same grits as the orbital sander, which is the 80, then the 180. I'm going to be getting in and around all these nooks and crannies, round down on these pieces, in and around the cheeks, around these back details. Now, this is where sanding becomes the most horrible part of making these props, is because the sanding bit takes so long, especially when it's hand sanding. You will also notice that around the bottom there are still some really rough details, and that's where the supports had been on and just haven't come off perfectly. Now you can see here this hasn't been touched, whereas this I've gone through with a soldering iron and just melted the plastic down and sort of just tried to smooth it out. Now you can do that, or you can try and hand sand this, maybe try and scrape it off. Maybe your supports have come off perfectly, whereas mine just haven't. But there are multiple ways you can kind of start to smooth that out. Just hand sand it, or you can use a Dremel, but you have to be super careful when using a Dremel because you could start melting the thing. But I'm just going to go through this with sandpaper. I'll probably go around on a soldering iron on the rest of these, sand them down, and then give them a nice round of filling so that then we can smooth it out. So without further ado, we'll go around with the 80 grit, roughen up, get all these messy bits, start to actually sand the backs. I might go through with the soldering iron just around some of the bits where there's supports left over and smooth the whole thing out. Alright, so the whole helmet has now been sanded and hand sanded. There are a couple little bits and pieces that I can definitely go over again, but this step is more just a lot of patience. Do it in little increments, maybe go and do that, go and do something else, come back, do some sanding, go and do something else. Otherwise you're going to get really sick and tired of just sanding and your hands are going to start to like hurt. So definitely just come back and forth on this. That's definitely the way that I find best for me. Obviously it's different for everyone. But the next step is going to be the filling. So for the filling, I'm just going to use some plastic wood filler. This stuff you can get really cheap at the hardware stores or on Amazon or eBay or anything. This one is used for filling really thin gaps, especially with 3D prints. They're thin little lines. And this is used for painters and stuff. It dries in about 2 hours, I find, and then it can just be sanded off with 180 grit sandpaper, which is absolutely perfect for what we need. So really any wood filler, plastic filler is going to work perfectly for this. The other thing you can use is Bondo Spot Glazed Putty. I don't have that in Australia, so my next best is just plastic filler, but anyone will do the trick just fine. So I'm just going to dab on little bits and pieces of this and just smooth it out either with my finger or sometimes I'll use like a really thin blade. I use a little blade painting scrape tool like this and just go around the parts, and because this is so thin, it's really easy to bend, which perfectly will shape any curve or something that we need. So without further ado, let's get on with filling.
Three hours later.
Alright, so the whole helmet has now been sanded with the 180 and all the filler has come off. Now, there are some rough spots just around the back and all that sort of stuff, but the main goal for this now is that we're going to get a round of filler primer on so we can sort of see any more layer lines that may be hidden because we kind of can't tell anymore where they are. So for this, we're going to be using some MTN Grey Filler Primer. This stuff's just for cars. I really like this stuff because it dries super quick. It dries in about like 4 hours or so, and that's ready for wet sanding or any sort of sanding. Whereas compared, I used to use the Rust-Oleum 2-in-1 Filler and Sandable. Now, don't get me wrong, that's some really good stuff, but for the stuff that I do, I personally don't really like it anymore because it takes like days to dry. And if it's not like the right atmosphere or all this random other stuff, it never dried properly. And it would always kind of gunk up, and it was really pretty much the same price as this, and this is car stuff, so it is a little bit better than the Rust-Oleum stuff, which is more for DIY hobby stuff. But that's the reason I'm going with the MTN, is I just like it a lot better, and it also is a nice bottle. So I'm going to do a sort of mid to light coat. I want enough that goes down so we can sort of get into some of these layer lines, get it nice and smooth, but I also don't want to go too hard that we start to lose some details. But really luckily with a helmet like this, the details are so big that we don't really lose much. So without further ado, we'll just get a coat of this stuff on and then we'll let it dry. Alright, so after the primer has dried, one step I did forget to mention before we primed this thing is that the helmet may come out looking pretty bad. And you can definitely see that within this. I did go a little bit heavy. If you don't go heavy with the primer, it won't dribble. But with its primer, it doesn't matter. We're going to be sanding this back anyway. But there's a lot of scratches and dents through from the 80 grit that still were here. But you will also then start to see all the other layer lines, which we missed a couple in here, a lot around the back, and just a couple around this cheek piece. But that's all right, we needed this primer to go down so we can find these little errors. So the next step is just basically repeating the previous step, which is just filling, then sanding, priming. And we're going to do that step quite a lot, and it's a little bit repetitive, but the more that you do it, the better that it is going to turn out, because the layer lines will start to disappear. We'll get a much smoother base. Now, I know this seems absolutely repetitive and a bit annoying, but this is how we get the super smooth helmets. In the end, is just a lot of filling and sanding, just to try and make everything super smooth, ready for paint. So I'm just going to be repeating this step again, is do another round of filling in all the spots that I can now see. So there'll be probably a little bit more filling than the first time that we did this, because we can see a lot more of these smaller details or scratches. Then once it's filled, I'll go back over it, sand it with the 180 grit. Then I'm going to go through the whole helmet with 240 grit sandpaper. Now the reason I do this is it gets off any of those little other scratches that may have peeled or something. I just like to go over it with 240 because it does make the helmet super smooth. Meaning when the primer goes down, we can see any of those rough spots even better, seeing that the whole helmet is going to be smooth. So I'm just going to go through again, fill, sand, until a point that I'm happy with, and then we'll keep going on from there. The Clone Trooper helmet just has another round of primer on it, and that's just drying at the moment. But the very last step that we need to do is something called a guide coat. So a guide coat is just a really thin layer of paint that's sort of misted on, so it'll be all speckly and all over the place. It's not meant to be uniform, it's not meant to be anything perfect. It's just a really good guide on when we start to wet sand, which areas may need more sanding or smoothing, rather than some bits where maybe they're higher and they've been knocked down quicker. When we wet sand, I'm going to go from 600 grit to 1000 grit to 2000 grit. I know I probably could do some like in betweens, but that's just what I have on hand, and I find it easier to do it that way. It really doesn't matter which grits of sandpaper, as long as it's really a nice high grit to finish it off to make the whole helmet super smooth, ready for paint. So our main goal with this is we're just going to be wet sanding off, making sure all the color disappears. In my case, I'm just going to be using cheap red that I have left over. There's not much left in the can, so I'm just going to use it, get rid of the can. It could be really any color, it doesn't matter what quality it is, it's just our guide. So we're going to do a little mist coat of that, then get onto the wet sanding, and then it'll pretty much be perfectly smooth, ready for paint. Alright, and that's the entire helmet sanded. Now, you can see a couple bits of red still around from my guide coat. I haven't fully gone through and finished this off. I'm just running a little bit low on time for getting this YouTube video out, but you kind of get the whole idea. Is just keep going until you kind of can't see any, or until you kind of feel that it's smooth. Like, I can definitely find some spots which are super smooth, but there's still some red. It doesn't really matter. These things are so small that you're not really going to notice them a whole lot. But that's pretty much my entire process of sanding it, filling it, priming it, hand sanding it, wet sanding, and the guide coat. Now, I hope this video helped some of you in making the decision to make your first 3D print and start sanding, or it gave you some advice on some new techniques that I do that maybe you didn't when sanding or something. But really, any technique works as long as those layer lines slowly disappear and you've got something that's relatively smooth that you're happy with. That's what matters. So that pretty much does it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Definitely don't forget to subscribe, because I'm going to be making this whole helmet into a cast mold so that I never have to sand a Clone Trooper again, because you can kind of see they're not fun to sand. So thank you so much for watching, and you have a good day.